When Caleb Dawson opened his door to the biting cold of a winter night, he wasn't expecting to find a woman with hollowed-out eyes and two children gripping the fabric of her coat. He let them in, offering nothing more than shelter. What he didn't realize was that this small, quiet act of compassion would eventually lead him to a courtroom he never imagined he'd step into, and to a judge who would fall into stunned silence the moment she heard his name. Before we step into this remarkable journey of second chances, quiet healing, and love that rose from ruin, be sure to subscribe. These are the kinds of stories that stay with you long after the last word fades. So let's go back to where it all began. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in a low, moaning hum, like a tune meant only for the trees, carrying with it a sharp cold that leaned hard against the walls of Caleb's cabin. The season's first snow had grown heavier, fat, stubborn flakes tapping softly against the glass like someone too polite to knock loud. Inside, the fire murmured as dry cedar cracked in the hearth and the kettle on the stove released a steady curl of steam. Caleb stood leaning against the kitchen counter, both hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with black coffee. He watched the snowfall, his eyes tired, not from sleep deprivation, but from the kind of weariness that lodges itself behind your ribs, right where sorrow likes to sit. Across the room, his daughter Hannah was curled up on the couch with a book nearly too big for her hands. She was 8, but sometimes felt 80, quiet, wise, and still in a way that comes only after loss. Since the accident that took her mother 2 winters back, Caleb hadn't heard her laugh. Not once. And some nights he wondered if he ever would again. Then the sound came, a knock, different from the wind or branches. 3 slow, uncertain taps, like someone hoping not to be heard but needing to try anyway. Caleb stiffened. He wasn't expecting company. Not tonight. Not any night, really. He placed the mug down, walked to the door, and eased it open. A rush of cold hit him like the echo of a memory he'd never invited in. What greeted him would change everything that came after. There, on the porch, stood a woman drenched in sleet, her coat clinging to her frame. Her hair, heavy with moisture, stuck to her cheeks, and she clutched a small girl, no older than 5, close to her chest. Another child, maybe 7, stood behind her, gripping her coat with small, shaking fingers. "I'm sorry," the woman said in a voice that barely cleared a whisper. "I didn't mean to intrude. The truck broke down. We were trying to find someplace warm for the night, and this cabin looked safe." Caleb's gaze shifted to the edge of the clearing where a battered pickup truck sat at an awkward angle, its hood hissing beneath a layer of snow. No headlights. No engine hum. Just quiet failure. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, pale, worn, but not broken. Her hands trembled, but her grip on the child didn't falter. Something about her stance sparked something old in him, a reflex from a time when he'd leap out of bed before the alarm, boots halfway on, racing toward fire. That part of him, the one trained to run into burning buildings, hadn't vanished. It was just buried beneath the soot and ache of too many losses. "You got anywhere else to go?" he asked after a moment. She shook her head, and he noticed her boots, unzipped, one lace snapped and dragging in the snow. "No family?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then answered softly, "Not anymore." There was a silence between them, just long enough for the wind to howl again through the trees. The child in her arms whimpered. Without another word, Caleb stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. She hesitated, her voice uncertain. "You sure?" That's when he noticed her eyes for the first time, green, sharp, glassy. Watchful. Protective. "If I wasn't sure, I wouldn't be standing here," he replied. "Get those kids inside before the cold makes them forget what toes feel like." The 3 of them shuffled in, quietly grateful. The older child, thin, pale, and carrying a backpack that looked ready to fall apart, glanced around with wary eyes the color of storm clouds. Caleb motioned toward the hearth. "Get warm," he said. "I'll grab some towels." By the time they'd peeled off their damp layers and huddled close to the fire, steam rising from their sleeves, Caleb had already filled the kettle again. "I'm Caleb," he told her, handing her a fresh mug. My daughter's Hannah. She's on the quiet side, so don't take it personal. The woman nodded, holding the cup like it contained something more than heat, like it might keep her together. Ivy, she said. And these are my girls, Isla and May. Caleb nodded once, then pulled up a chair across from her, close enough to listen, far enough not to intrude. No one spoke for a while. The only sounds were the wind brushing against the windows and the low hum of something unspoken shifting between them like a river slowly changing course. Caleb didn't know it yet, but that night would be the first time in years he slept without dreaming of fire. And tucked away in the kitchen drawer, beneath a half-used notepad and a few rusted screws, was a red handkerchief scorched at the edges, a relic from the last rescue he ever made. The one that stayed with him no matter how many times he told himself it was over. The cabin had always been quiet, but now it felt quieter still. Not the comforting kind. The kind of quiet that presses up against the walls like a question no one wants to ask. Caleb moved through the kitchen with the kind of rhythm that comes from doing everything yourself. Soup warmed on the stove. Bread was sliced. Mugs were filled. He didn't ask for explanations. Not yet. He knew well enough that some truths don't come easy, they need a little warmth and time first. Ivy sat near the fire, her posture upright despite the weariness in her bones. Isla and May were already wrapped in Hannah's old blankets, fast asleep before the soup had even cooled. Hannah sat across the room in her usual armchair, knees pulled close, eyes fixed on the flames. She hadn't spoken since they arrived, but she hadn't left either. And that, for now, felt like its own kind of welcome. Caleb placed a bowl of soup in front of Ivy and pulled up a chair, not too close, not too far. She whispered a soft thank you and took a sip, though her hands still shook. He studied her in the flickering firelight. The shadows deepened the tired lines of her face, but her eyes stayed alert. Not frightened, just watchful, like a deer scanning the edge of a clearing before deciding to step into it. You from nearby? He asked quietly. She shook her head. 3 towns over. We've been moving. How long? She paused. Since July. 4 months. 4 months of wandering with 2 children and nowhere to land. Caleb tried to picture it and couldn't. He took a breath, slow and steady. You don't owe me the whole story, he said. But if someone's out there looking for you. There's not, she cut in a little too fast. Then she softened. There's no one left. That was all she said. And it was enough. Caleb nodded, and the silence that returned wasn't awkward this time. It was mutual. You and your daughters are welcome here, Caleb told her. For however long you need. Ivy didn't respond with words. She blinked quickly, nodding once, like speaking might shatter the fragile calm hanging between them. Later that evening, after the girls were tucked into their makeshift beds, Caleb opened a drawer in the living room cabinet he hadn't touched in years. Buried beneath scattered screws and an old flashlight with a cracked lens was a red handkerchief folded neatly. The edges were scorched, the center still stained with soot. He hadn't held it in a long time. Couldn't quite explain why he'd kept it, only that it was a reminder that he'd once done something meaningful. Something brave. Before everything fell apart. He turned it over slowly, fingers brushing the charred cloth, then placed it back where it was. Behind him, Ivy stirred in her sleep, murmuring a name too faint to catch. As the days passed, the snow seemed to linger longer on the roof, draping the cabin in a stillness that felt both heavy and holy. The light shifted, the days grew shorter, and Caleb began moving more gently through the house, listening with an attentiveness he hadn't practiced in years. It wasn't just the crunch of snow or the groan of the wind he was noticing. It was Ivy humming softly while folding laundry, the light steps of Isla padding across the floorboards, the quiet sound of Hannah whispering something to May while they worked on a puzzle near the fireplace. None of it was normal to him, but all of it was beginning to feel like life again. One morning, Caleb stood by the back window, coffee in hand, staring out at the stretch of woods that had once marked the edge of his world, where it had all ended for him 3 years ago, and somehow where something new had begun. He didn't pretend to understand it, only that it was real. From behind him came Ivy's voice, faint and steady. She was on the sofa, folding clothes while humming a tune that stirred something in him. Caleb didn't recognize the song, but it carried a distant familiarity, like something his mother might have played on the kitchen radio when he was small. "Where'd you learn that one?" he asked, curiosity edging his voice. She looked up, blinking. "That? My grandmother used to sing it to us when we were kids. We didn't have much, but she always said music could warm a cold day better than fire." Caleb offered a faint smile. "Sounds like she was a woman who understood things." "She did," Ivy said, her voice dipping lower. Her eyes darkened. "But knowing things doesn't mean you can save everyone." Her words hung between them, delicate and cold, like breath against cold glass. Caleb didn't push. He understood that invisible line people draw, the one between what they're willing to say and what they've had to survive. Later that day, as the sun stretched long shadows over the snow, Ivy joined him outside to haul in firewood. They worked side by side in quiet rhythm, stacking logs onto the old sled Caleb used to drag the load to the porch. As she reached for another log, her sleeve slipped back. Caleb's eyes caught on a thin scar tracing its way from her wrist to just below her elbow. It wasn't recent, but it was deep and unmistakable. She noticed his glance and quickly tugged her sleeve down. "Kitchen accident," she said with too much ease, brushing it off. Caleb said nothing. He recognized that tone, one people used when they needed to shut a door gently without inviting questions. He let it be. But that night, after the girls were asleep, Ivy lingered by the fire longer than usual, nursing a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "why some people seem to remember every shard of pain, while others just forget what matters most?" Caleb turned to her, unsure where she was going, but listening. "I mean," she continued, eyes lost in the flames, "some people go through terrible things and carry it around like luggage they can't put down. And others, they leave wreckage behind and still get to walk away like saints." The silence that followed was long and needed. Then Caleb said quietly, "I used to think forgetting was the harshest thing. But these days I think maybe it's the ones who carry it that suffer more." Ivy turned toward him, her face softening as though something tight inside her had finally loosened. "I lost someone," she said. "My husband. Cancer took him slowly. But honestly, I lost him long before that." She paused. "He wasn't good to us. Not to me. Not to the girls." Caleb didn't flinch or look away. He just nodded, steady and silent. "No one believed me," she said. "His family thought I was being dramatic, unstable. Said I was just emotional. And when he died, they treated me like the problem, not the widow." She let out a hollow laugh. "So I packed what I could, grabbed the girls, and left. I didn't know where I was headed. I just knew I couldn't stay." Caleb shifted slightly in his seat. "I'm sorry," he said, not out of habit, but from somewhere real. Ivy shrugged. "We've been sleeping in shelters, car seats, cheap motels if I could find a job that paid cash. Every week, I told myself, just one more week. One more map rerouted." She glanced around the room. "But then we ended up here. And then there was you." Caleb didn't respond right away. His chest felt heavier than before, but not from sorrow. From knowing. Because there are different kinds of fires in this world. And Ivy had walked through one just as fierce as anything he'd ever faced in uniform. He reached into the drawer beside his chair, the one he hadn't opened in ages. Out came the red handkerchief. "I know a thing or two about carrying things," he said. 15 years back, I pulled a woman out of a building as it collapsed. It was my last call before I blew my back out. Never saw her face, she was out cold when I carried her." He held up the handkerchief, careful. This was tied around her wrist. Ivy leaned closer. "Did she ever come back?" He shook his head. "No. I never looked either. Told myself it didn't matter, that I was just doing my job." She looked at him gently. "But it did matter." He nodded. "Yeah, it did. Still does." The two of them sat in the fire's glow, the weight of everything unspoken finally resting between them, not crushing, just shared. Neither of them reached out. Neither made a promise. But something shifted in that quiet, like two beams in a broken roof finally leaning into each other just enough to keep it from falling in. And upstairs, in the soft hush of a child's room, Hannah whispered to Isla the name of her favorite stuffed bear. The next stretch of days moved with a gentle rhythm Caleb hadn't realized he missed. Mornings with fresh coffee, little bursts of laughter from the girls, the smell of bread rising in the oven. Nothing dramatic, nothing perfect, but it felt real. And that was more than enough. Caleb started noticing the small ways his house was changing even without meaning to. Tiny boots at the door, a braid of garlic hanging by the window, a child's drawing taped to the fridge, 5 stick figures. 4 were smiling. One had a lopsided mouth Hannah later told him was Dad when he's trying not to smile. But it was Hannah herself who surprised him most. She began reading stories aloud to May and Isla, her voice quiet, cautious, like she was relearning how to trust it. And one evening she let Ivy braid her hair, something even her grandma couldn't get her to allow after her mom passed. Still, even as warmth slowly crept back into the corners of his life, Caleb knew better than to get too comfortable too soon. He'd lived through enough winters to know that sometimes, beneath soft snow, the ground is still ice. One day, he came back from town with supplies and noticed a beige sedan sitting at the far end of the drive. It looked like it didn't belong. A woman stood on the porch, rigid, polished, her fur-lined coat spotless despite the snow. Inside, Ivy had gone still, her steps frozen, her lips drawn tight. The woman turned as Caleb approached. She was in her late 50s, sharp eyes, tight mouth, the kind of person whose jewelry spoke in whispers, wealth and disapproval. "You must be Mr. Dawson," she said, offering a gloved hand. "I am," Caleb answered, setting the bag down without shaking hers. "I'm Vivian Blake, Ivy's sister-in-law," her late husband's side. Caleb gave a slow nod, his face unreadable. "I've been trying to track her down for months," Vivian said. "When she stopped returning our calls, we grew concerned." Ivy stood behind the screen door, completely still. "She's been safe here," Caleb said, his voice calm. "Safe?" Vivian repeated with a cold chuckle. "With some unfamiliar man in a cabin, miles from anything?" Caleb's jaw tensed. "She's not trapped here. If Ivy wants to go, the door's always open." Vivian shifted her focus to Ivy. "We're not here to argue, sweetheart. But you took those girls and vanished. That's not how custody arrangements work. Legally speaking, the family still has rights." "They're my children," Ivy said quietly, finally stepping out onto the porch. "I never signed over control. You have no legal claim. And you never filed for guardianship either, or even registered a permanent address. That's what the courts call instability. They're safe. They're healthy. They're happy," Ivy said. Caleb cut in. "Ask them yourself if they want to leave with you." "That's enough," Vivian interrupted. "This isn't a courtroom." "Not yet," she added, her tone icy as her gaze narrowed. "But it will be." She handed Ivy a sealed envelope, her tight smile betraying satisfaction. "Consider this a courtesy before we go the formal route." With that, she turned and walked away, her boots making sharp, deliberate sounds on the frozen ground. Ivy remained standing in the doorway long after the car disappeared down the road. Her hands trembled as she clutched the envelope. That night, something about the warmth of the cabin felt thinner, like the quiet had picked up a chill. Hannah slept curled up even closer to her stuffed bear than usual. Isla barely spoke. May kept asking if they'd have to leave again. Caleb found Ivy sitting on the steps, sleeves pulled down over her hands, the cold biting through the fabric. "She's bluffing," he said, easing down beside her. Ivy shook her head. "No, she's not. She has money, she knows people, and me? I've got a truck that barely runs, a notebook full of unfinished jobs, no permanent address, and no lawyer." "You've got me," Caleb said quietly. She looked over at him, caught off guard. "I'm not saying I can fix everything," he added. "But you won't be standing alone." Her eyes blinked fast, emotions threatening to spill. "I didn't ask you to do that." "You didn't have to," he replied. "I chose to." She looked away, her voice catching. "They'll call me unstable. Say I ran off." Say I've been living in some stranger's house. Then we show them the truth, Caleb said. Ivy gave a dry, bitter smile. Truth doesn't matter in court. Paper does. Caleb paused, then gently asked, do you still want to fight? Yes, she whispered. More than anything. But I'm so damn tired of losing. Caleb didn't try to convince her with words. Instead, he just reached for her hand. And for the first time since she walked into his life, she didn't pull away. The following morning, Caleb drove her into town to meet someone who might help, a local legal aid attorney named Mr. Thorne, who used to be a judge and now worked out of a small trailer tucked behind the gas station. He listened as Ivy explained everything patiently without interrupting. When she finished, he rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said, You've got a tough road ahead, no doubt. But it's not impossible. He leaned forward. Courts look at stability, sure. But what really matters is the children's well-being. Letters from teachers, neighbors, doctors, those speak volumes. And if you can show that these girls are thriving in a place that's safe, that's loving. He looked toward Caleb. Then that might tip the scale. Ivy walked out with a list of documents to gather, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and something she hadn't carried in a long time, hope. That evening, the fire crackled steadily in the hearth. Hannah and Isla sat cross-legged on the floor, braiding bracelets from colored yarn, their giggles light and unguarded. Caleb was chopping carrots at the kitchen counter when he caught Ivy watching the girls. Her expression was unreadable. What's on your mind? He asked. She blinked slowly. You ever think some people aren't just passing through your life, but were always meant to show up when they did? Caleb smiled at her. Yeah, I think about that every day now. The next morning brought a wind that howled through the trees like it had something urgent to say. It rattled the windows, and for the first time in weeks, the cabin felt uneasy, like it was bracing for what was coming. Ivy sat at the kitchen table, a neat stack of papers in front of her. Her hair was pulled back tight, like it was holding her together. Hannah sat nearby, quietly coloring. Isla and May were busy building a pillow fort out of couch cushions. Caleb came in through the back door, knocking snow from his boots. In his hand was a registered envelope. He didn't speak, just placed it on the table in front of Ivy. She stared at it for a long while, then slid a finger under the seal and tore it open with more control than feeling. The first page was blunt. Summons to appear before the family court of Iron County. And beneath that a date. Just 2 weeks away. Her shoulders slumped. The paper trembled in her grip. They're not bluffing, she whispered. Caleb pulled a chair out and sat across from her. Then we won't either. The following days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet moments laced with anxiety. Mr. Thorne was patient but didn't sugarcoat the facts. The other side's got resources, lawyers, money, connections, he said, adjusting his glasses. But that doesn't mean they've got a strong case. What we need to do is build a full picture, not just where the girls came from, but what kind of life they're building now. He gestured toward the folder Ivy had brought in, handwritten notes from the girls' pediatrician, the local church pantry, and Caleb's longtime neighbor, Mrs. Kinney, who had started dropping off muffins and warm glances without needing a reason. But this, he said, tapping a page, Caleb's affidavit, this carries weight. Caleb looked up. It's nothing special. Just the truth. Thorne nodded. And sometimes that's stronger than any law book. Still, the odds weren't pretty. Vivian Blake had wealth, influence, and the ability to frame a narrative. And family court? It didn't always have room for heart when paper trails were missing. One quiet evening, with the girls asleep and the moon hanging low over the trees, Ivy sat wrapped in one of Caleb's flannel shirts out on the porch. The moonlight caught her face just right, aging her and softening her all at once. I've fought for things before, she said in a whisper. But never like this. Not with so much on the line. Caleb sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. They're not just yours anymore, he said gently. They belong to this place now. To Hannah. To me. She turned her head to him, eyes damp. Do you ever regret opening that door? He didn't need to think. Not even for a second. She gave a small nod. The tears didn't fall, but they glistened. I don't know how to thank you for all of it. You don't have to, Caleb said, his voice quiet. Just stay. Days ticked by. The snow rose in drifts around the cabin. The air filled with the scent of soup, the soft rise and fall of bedtime stories, and the laughter of children learning to stand on steady ground again. Then came the day before court. Caleb got up before dawn and put on the only suit he still owned. It was a little outdated and didn't fit like it used to, but it was clean. Hannah stood beside him in a navy dress, notebook in hand. Ivy came out in a dark green wool coat, one that Mrs. Kinney must have left the week before. She looked poised, even if her hands fiddled nervously with the buttons. They drove in near silence. Snow blew across the road like ghosts from the past. Caleb kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting on his knee, tempted to reach for Ivy's, but not wanting to rush the moment. The courthouse stood like a block of concrete, cold, gray, impersonal. Inside, the waiting room was thick with tension. Lawyers carrying briefcases. Families clutching one another in hope or fear. Ivy sat beside Caleb, her hands clasped tight. I'm not praying to win, she whispered. Just for something fair. Caleb gave her hand a gentle squeeze. That's all we need. When the clerk finally called their case, Caleb and Ivy stepped into the courtroom. The space was imposing, polished wooden benches, soaring ceilings, and a silence designed to remind everyone how serious this place was. The judge's chair at the front sat empty. Their assigned seats were on the left. Across the aisle, Vivian Blake sat upright between two attorneys, a clipboard stacked with documents in front of her. She didn't glance at Ivy, not once. Her attention stayed locked on the front of the room. Then a door creaked open. A woman stepped in wearing a black robe that somehow made her seem both commanding and calm. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a neat twist. And the lines on her face told stories of hard decisions and sleepless nights. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Presiding, the Honorable Judge Celeste Rowan. Beside Caleb, Ivy stiffened slightly. Caleb looked up and saw the judge freeze for just a fraction of a second. Her gaze landed on him and lingered longer than it should have. The rest of the courtroom missed it. But he didn't. She blinked quickly, gave a small nod, and took her seat behind the bench. It was a tiny pause, easy to miss, but the energy in the room shifted ever so slightly. Judge Rowan straightened, composed, hands folded neatly, voice clear. We are gathered to consider the custody petition filed by Ms. Vivian Blake, she began. She is requesting legal guardianship of minors Isla and Mae Westbrook, who are currently in the care of their biological mother, Ivy Westbrook. Her tone was even, steady. But the recognition wasn't in Ivy's name. Only Caleb's. Ivy's grip on the edge of the table tightened, knuckles pale. The opposing attorney, a polished man in a tailored suit with the kind of voice made for microphones, began presenting his case. He spoke of instability. He laid out risk factors. He cited concerns over the children's well-being. Vivian sat beside him, nodding solemnly, her expression thin and self-assured, like justice was something she'd already purchased. Caleb watched the judge carefully. She asked questions, took notes, her body language composed. But when Vivian made a pointed comment that the children were living in an improvised cabin with a man unrelated to them, Judge Rowan's pen halted mid-sentence. Just for a beat? Then it was Ivy's turn to speak. Her voice held steady, though it carried a tension like a string stretched too far, almost singing with strain. She didn't dramatize. She talked about dinner tables, homework, reading bedtime stories. She listed the jobs she'd worked, the appointments she hadn't missed, the blankets they carried from town to town, hoping each stop might be the last time they slept in the truck. Then Caleb stood. No speeches. No performance. I didn't take them in to be a hero, he said quietly. I let them in because it was the right thing to do. Because they were cold and scared and I had a fire burning and a roof that didn't leak. He paused, looking the judge straight in the eye. And I've kept that fire going every day since. Something shifted then. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Even Vivian's lawyer glanced down at the table as if reminded that facts on paper don't always outmatch lived truth. Judge Rowan leaned in just slightly. "Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice slower now. "Were you at any point in public service?" Caleb nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Fire Department. District 6. Until 2009. The judge's lips parted ever so slightly before pressing together again. "Thank you." She thumbed through her paperwork, then turned toward Vivian. "Ms. Blake, you've claimed instability. Can you provide evidence, any documentation, that these children have experienced harm under their mother's care? Academic decline? Medical neglect? Anything physical?" Vivian faltered. "We don't have that kind of evidence, no. But she's been staying with a man who isn't family. There's no formal agreement." "That wasn't what I asked," the judge interrupted more firmly now. "Do you have proof, any proof, that these children have been harmed?" Vivian hesitated, then said what everyone already knew. "No." Judge Rowan nodded slowly. "And yet you're asking this court to remove them from their mother. A mother who, by your own admission, has kept them safe, healthy, and stable." She glanced at her notes. Then, without any warning, said, "We'll take a short recess." She struck the gavel once. The room released a collective breath. Out in the hallway, Caleb leaned back against the cool wall, jaw clenched. Ivy sat beside him, hands resting quietly in her lap. The girls waited with Hannah and Mrs. Kinney, who, in true small-town fashion, had arrived with a thermos of hot cider and more loyalty than words. "I saw it," Ivy whispered. "The way she looked at you." Caleb gave a slow nod. "I saw it too. I just don't know what it means." "You recognize her?" He shook his head. "I don't think so. But her voice, something about it felt familiar." Ivy tilted her head, half smiling. "Maybe she knows you, just not from this lifetime." He almost smiled back. Almost. When they returned to the courtroom, the judge took longer than expected to reappear. When she did, her robe sat slightly off-center, her hair not quite as neat. She sat down without speaking for several moments. Then, slowly, she turned to Caleb. "Mr. Dawson," she said, her voice softer now. "I'd like to confirm something for the record." Caleb straightened. "Yes, Your Honor? Did you respond to a fire on West 6th Street in April of 2009? He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Was that your final call?" He paused, then nodded. "It was." The judge closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled. When she opened them, her voice caught with something quiet and personal. "I was the woman in that building." A hush rippled across the room. "I was unconscious. I never saw your face. But I remember your voice. I remember you said, 'Don't fall asleep. Someone's waiting for you.' I didn't know who you were, not until today. But when you spoke earlier, it was like a string that had been tight for 15 years finally snapped back into place." Caleb didn't move, but beside him, Ivy gently reached for his hand. Judge Rowan straightened her shoulders, her voice regaining its formality, but the emotion remained in her eyes. "This court doesn't deal in favors. It deals in facts, in truth. And today, I heard a truth that outweighs paperwork, bank accounts, and social standing." She looked directly at Vivian Blake. "You have the legal right to bring a petition, but you do not have the moral right to rip children from a home grounded in love and safety." Then, she folded her hands. "Petition denied." Another silence fell, but this one wasn't empty. It was full of breath held and released, of hearts that had cracked open just enough to let something in. Caleb turned toward Ivy. Tears streamed down her face. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Relief. Peace. For once, she didn't look like someone barely holding on. She looked like someone finally letting go. Across the room, Judge Celeste Rowan sat quietly, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Not for the fire she'd once escaped, but for the present moment she'd just helped safeguard. Outside, snow drifted gently down, blanketing the courthouse steps, as though even the sky understood something sacred had taken place inside. Caleb stood near the doors with Ivy by his side, the girls clinging tightly to her coat. Neither of them spoke much. There weren't words big enough to hold what had just happened. They stepped into the cold together, the silence of the world around them somehow profound. The courthouse loomed behind them, not as a place of judgment now, but as a symbol of grace. It wasn't just that justice had been served. It had been felt. Mrs. Kinney pulled Ivy into a hug full of quiet understanding, then turned to Caleb and gave him a nod so full of respect it felt like a badge of honor. "I'll take the girls and Hannah ahead," she whispered to Ivy, brushing the hair from May's forehead. "You too. Take a moment. Breathe." Then she gathered the children and led them toward the truck, leaving Caleb and Ivy alone on the steps. Caleb stayed still, his gaze resting on the parking lot in the distance. "You okay?" he asked finally. Ivy looked at him, then down at her gloves, her voice soft. "I didn't know I could cry like that. Not from sadness, but from something deeper." He gave a slow nod. "I know exactly what you mean." She exhaled, a shaky breath that fogged the air between them. "Do you think she planned it? Everything she said?" "Judge Rowan?" Caleb shook his head. "No. I think she's been carrying that moment for years, just like we've carried ours, waiting for something to give it meaning." They stood side by side for a few quiet seconds, then turned and walked slowly toward the truck. But before they reached it, a voice called from behind them. "Mr. Dawson." Caleb turned. It was Judge Celeste Rowan, but she was no longer the figure of authority on the bench. Just a woman now, her silver hair loose in the wind, a red scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. Ivy paused a few steps behind, sensing something private unfolding. "I don't mean to intrude," Celeste said, her breath catching in the cold, "but I couldn't leave without saying something more." Caleb nodded slightly, letting her speak. She stepped closer, her eyes bright with emotion. "After that fire, I woke up in a hospital. My daughter was asleep in the chair next to me. The doctors said I was minutes away from never waking up at all. I asked about the firefighter who carried me out," she continued. "No one knew who you were. You were already gone before anyone had the chance to say thank you." "I wasn't there for the thanks," Caleb said softly. She nodded, voice catching. "I know. That's how I knew it was you. That voice, the same calm strength I heard while everything around me was burning." From her coat pocket, she pulled out a photograph, creased and slightly faded. In it, she stood holding her daughter's hand outside the scorched remains of a building. A bandage wrapped her forehead. Ash smudged her cheeks, and in the edge of the frame, barely visible, was the back of a firefighter walking away. She held the photo out to him. "I've kept this all these years," she said. "Not because it's clear, but because it's the only thing I have from the moment my life changed." Caleb took it, studied the image in silence, then returned it with quiet reverence. "You didn't just save my life," she said, voice trembling. "You changed how I chose to live it after. I left my job at the firm, applied to become a judge. I wanted to be someone who could stand between others and the fire." She stepped back slightly, her throat tightening with emotion. "And today, I finally got to do that." Caleb didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was softer than Ivy had ever heard it. "I'm glad I didn't leave you behind." Celeste nodded gently. "So am I." She turned to go, then paused and looked over her shoulder. "If either of you ever need anything, legal help, something personal, or just a cup of coffee, don't hesitate to call." She handed Caleb a small card. "Not the judge," she said. "Just Eleanor." With that, she offered a final smile and disappeared into the quiet snowfall. Back at the cabin, the fire glowed softly in the hearth. Mrs. Kinney had left a tray of sandwiches on the table, and the girls were curled up on the rug like nothing had ever happened in a courtroom that day. Caleb stood in the doorway watching them, a strange weight pressing on his chest, not heavy, just full. Ivy stepped in beside him, brushing snow off her coat. "They look like they've always belonged here," she murmured. "Feels like they have," Caleb replied. She reached into her bag and pulled out the official court envelope. "It's strange," she said. "Everything we've lived through, and it all boils down to this." Caleb took the envelope from her and slipped it into a drawer. "Let it rest," he said gently. Ivy looked up at him, her eyes steady. "And us?" she asked. He paused, not because he wasn't sure, but because the moment deserved respect. "We're just getting started," he said. That night, once the girls were asleep, Caleb sat out on the porch with a warm mug of tea in hand. Ivy joined him, wrapped in a quilt, her footsteps light. They didn't speak at first. They didn't have to. Above them, the stars blinked softly in the clear sky. The forest whispered secrets to the night. And somewhere deep in the trees, an owl called once, low and distant. "Do you ever think things like this happen for a reason?" Ivy asked quietly. Caleb took a slow breath. "I'm not sure," he said. "But I do think when you choose to do the right thing for someone else, sometimes life remembers." She turned her head to look at him, and in her eyes was something warmer than simple gratitude, something that stayed. Something like love. And in that quiet space between snow and stars, something began to mend. February crept in gently. The snow outside no longer looked fresh, but settled, packed into the earth like a blanket folded and smoothed by time. The storm had passed. The blizzard, yes, but also the one in court that had nearly blown Ivy's life apart. And the calm that followed wasn't empty. It throbbed with something alive. Something fragile. A promise not yet spoken aloud. Caleb could feel it in the way Ivy stirred her tea each morning, deliberate, slow, like she was relearning stillness. He saw it in Hannah's unguarded laughter. In May and Isla, who now bickered like sisters, confident they wouldn't be packed up again tomorrow. And most telling of all, Ivy had started leaving her suitcase zipped. To Caleb, that said more than any speech ever could. One crisp morning, Caleb was out by the woodpile, axe in hand, falling into the rhythm of splitting logs. Ivy stepped outside holding 2 mugs of coffee. She didn't say anything, just handed him one and sat on the edge of the porch. They sat in quiet harmony, the sound of the axe biting into wood, birds tapping at the eaves, and the stillness that now felt like home. "I've been wondering," Ivy said after a while, "if we'd met in some other way, would this have ever happened?" Caleb paused mid-swing. "You mean if you hadn't shown up on my porch half-frozen with 2 little ones?" She smiled. "Yeah, if we'd met at a coffee shop, clean, put together, would we have really seen each other?" He slammed the axe down one last time, then leaned it against the porch post. "I think we would have been polite," he said. "Maybe even friendly. But no, we wouldn't have really seen each other." Ivy tilted her head slightly. "And now?" "Now?" Caleb said, looking at her. "Now I see you." Their eyes held, and the silence between them took on a different texture, something softer. "Closer. I haven't told you something," Ivy said, her gaze drifting toward the woods. "It's not awful. Just mine. And I'm not sure what to do with it anymore." Caleb sat down beside her, hands wrapped around his mug, patient. "I'm here," he said simply. "You can share it or not. Either way. I'll still be here tomorrow. Whatever it is," Caleb said gently, "you can tell me or not. Either way, I'll be here tomorrow." Ivy gave a small nod and drew in a slow breath. "That scar on my arm, it wasn't from a kitchen accident." Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't question her. Just waited. "I got it pulling my girls out of our old house after a fire broke out in the kitchen. It wasn't huge, but the smoke was brutal. I remember choking on it, crawling through the dark, yelling their names." She paused. They were in their room, and I was just 2 seconds too far away. Caleb shifted closer, letting his hand rest softly over hers. "I got them out," she said, "but not before the neighbors came running. The story ended up in the local paper and suddenly I wasn't a mother, I was a headline. Reckless widow. Emotionally unstable. Not fit to raise children. Her eyes blinked dryly, no tears came, just a quiet ache behind every word. The worst part, she added. No one even asked what happened before the fire. Why I was the only one who ran in. Caleb sat with her in the silence, not trying to fix it, just holding space. I know the kind of blame, he said. Trying your hardest and being punished for it anyway. That cuts deep. He looked at her, voice steady. But I see you, Ivy. I see what you've carried. And I see what you've saved. She nodded slowly, letting his words land. Thank you for saying that. For meaning it. Later that afternoon, the girls built a snow fort in the yard. Hannah had hauled out old pots and wooden spoons, stirring up pretend soup made of snow and twigs. From the porch, Ivy watched them, laughter rising from her like something rediscovered. Caleb came outside carrying a blanket and draped it around her shoulders without a word. You know, he said, settling beside her, there's something I never told you either. She glanced over, curious. The day I rescued Judge Rowan from that fire, he began, I remember thinking it might be the last thing I ever did. His voice lowered. It was my day off. I was supposed to be at a parent-teacher meeting with Hannah's mom. But I answered the call anyway. He paused there. And I've carried that decision ever since. Ivy tilted her head slightly. Do you regret it? He shook his head. No. Because that one choice led me here. To this moment. To you. She placed her hand on his arm, firm, steady. You saved someone that day, Caleb. And then you saved someone again when you opened your door to us. He didn't answer out loud, but the look in his eyes said everything, that something long buried in him had finally begun to heal. That evening, the cabin was bathed in golden quiet. The girls had fallen asleep early, cheeks still pink from the cold. Caleb and Ivy sat together on the couch, the fire down to soft embers. Ivy turned toward him. So, what comes next? Caleb stared into the flames for a moment before answering. We live. We cook dinners. Do homework. Fix leaky faucets. Maybe start a garden when spring rolls around. Ivy smiled. A garden. He shrugged. Hannah's determined to grow carrots. I told her she was nuts. She told me to just wait and see. She rested her head gently on his shoulder, just enough to feel the quiet thump of his heart beneath the flannel. Sounds like the beginning of something, she whispered. Caleb reached over and laid his hand on hers. It already is. By the next week, the snow had started to melt in uneven patches, revealing damp earth beneath, as though the land itself was remembering how to breathe again. With the thaw came a quiet expectancy, a pause before something new takes root. Inside, the fire still glowed, but the heavy coats had been replaced with lighter ones. Mud still tracked through the front door, but not as much. The air carried a soft scent of pine and cinnamon. And the mornings? They no longer felt like something to survive. They felt like a beginning. Ivy had started scribbling in a small leather journal, lists of groceries, rough garden plans, even a sketch of a window with homemade curtains. It was a quiet act of defiance against the chaos she'd once lived in. Caleb never asked what she was writing. He just made sure there was always a pen nearby. One morning, he found her at the kitchen table, fingers gently tracing the photograph Judge Rowan had given him. She held it like it was sacred. She never knew your name, Ivy murmured. Caleb nodded. I never gave it. Why not? He sat across from her, their coffee steaming between them. Because it wasn't about me. I wasn't doing it for recognition. He met her gaze. But now, I understand what a name can hold. She folded the photo and tucked it into the back of her journal. I think she came to that hearing for more than justice, she said softly. Caleb raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I think she needed to find you not as a judge, but as a person. To thank the man who gave her life back. Caleb was quiet, then finally said, She gave us something too. That same afternoon, Ivy took the truck into town by herself for the first time since everything had changed. She came back with groceries, a packet of seeds, and a sealed envelope. She didn't open it until the girls were tucked in for the night. Caleb found her on the porch, fingers tight around the envelope, worry etched deep into her expression. "What is it?" he asked, sitting beside her. "It's from the court," she said, handing it over. "Not a summons. Just final paperwork." He held it for a moment but didn't open it either. Instead, he reached for her hand. "I thought I'd feel relief," Ivy whispered. "Like I could finally breathe. But now I'm scared. I don't know what comes next. Not with the girls. Not with you. Not even with myself." Caleb set the envelope aside and looked at her, steady. "You don't need to know," he said. "We'll figure it out together. That's what we've been doing all along, isn't it?" She looked at him, then really looked like she was trying to read the future in his eyes. "But what if I screw this up?" she asked. "What if I lose everything again?" "You won't," he said, calm as ever. "Because you already know what it costs to lose. And you know how to fight for what matters." Her eyes welled with tears. But still she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned in and kissed his cheek, gentle, uncertain, like she was asking permission to hope. He didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his head and kissed her, soft and unhurried, like time had stretched open just for them. And maybe it had. Later that night, after the fire had died down and the girls had fallen asleep, Ivy finally opened the envelope. Inside was a notarized letter confirming full legal custody. Clean. Simple. But at the bottom, in a careful script, was a handwritten note from Judge Celeste Rowan. "Sometimes the law affirms what the heart already knows. May this new beginning bring you peace. Not because it forgets the past, but because it honors it." Ivy read the letter twice, then quietly tucked it behind the photograph in her journal. She didn't wake Caleb. Instead, she climbed into bed beside him, let their hands find each other beneath the quilt, and allowed the fear she'd carried for so long to slide off her like a coat she no longer needed. The following Sunday, Caleb brought the girls out behind the cabin into the muddy field that hadn't seen much life in years. It was uneven and messy, still tangled with brush, but in his eyes, it looked like promise. "We're planting carrots?" Hannah asked skeptically, a raised eyebrow already loaded with doubt. Eventually, Caleb said, smiling, "But first, we clear the ground. One step at a time." He girls wasted no time getting to work, tugging stubborn roots from the garden soil with determination. A few minutes later, Ivy appeared, seed packets and gloves in hand. She didn't ask what they were up to. She simply stepped in and joined them. And as the late afternoon sun poured across the yard, casting long shadows over 5 figures laughing and working side by side in muddy boots, Caleb looked around and felt something stir deep in his chest. It wasn't exactly happiness. And it wasn't just relief. It was a sense of belonging. Not to a place, but to them. And in that moment, he didn't need to speak to know something had shifted for good. Later that evening, while they cleaned up after dinner, Ivy paused by the fireplace. She stared at the only framed photo Caleb had ever allowed, him in uniform, taken just before he walked away from the department. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "To firefighting?" She gave a small nod. He exhaled slowly. "Not to run into burning buildings," he said. "But maybe to teach. Help train the next wave. It's been on my mind lately." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I think you'd be damn good at that." Caleb met her gaze, softer now. "And you? If you could do anything, no limits, what would it be?" Ivy went quiet for a moment, considering. Then she looked up and said, calm and sure, "I'd stay." Spring came softly to Cold Springs. Not with a grand entrance, but with melting patches of snow and sunlight that lingered just a little longer each day. The creek behind the cabin found its voice again, trickling where ice had once silenced it. Tiny green buds peeked out along bare branches. It was as if the world itself was learning how to begin again. Inside the cabin, change was less visible, but just as real. Hannah had started pinning her drawings to the fridge, each one brighter than the last. May no longer asked if they'd still be here in the morning. Isla began reading aloud, her voice gaining confidence with each sentence. "And Ivy." Ivy had stopped stiffening every time the mailbox clanked shut. One Saturday morning, Caleb stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the girls dig rows into their little patch of garden. It wasn't much, just a few hopeful furrows carved into the soil, but seeing them work together, argue gently, and dream aloud was worth more than any picture-perfect plan. Ivy stepped outside, sighing as she joined him, her eyes scanning the sky. "They're putting down roots," she said quietly. Caleb smiled. "So are we." She didn't look away, but her expression softened. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Yeah? I want to go back to school." He blinked, caught off guard. "You do?" "Yeah," she said, with a small laugh. "I never finished. Life happened. The kids. Then just surviving. But now I want more than survival." Caleb leaned on the railing, letting that settle in. "What would you study?" "Social work, maybe, or child development. Something that lets me help people who've lived what I've lived through." She turned to him, sincerity shining in her eyes. "Someone showed up for me. Judge Rowan, Mr. Thorne. Maybe it's time I do the same for someone else." Caleb's smile reached all the way to his eyes. "I think you'd be incredible. I don't want to stop being a mom to do it," she added quickly. "I just want to reclaim more of who I am." He reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You won't have to do it alone." That evening, while Caleb patched a few shingles on the roof, the scent of cornbread baking drifted up through the chimney, warm and rich with rosemary and butter. When he came back inside, the smell hit him like a memory waiting to happen. Comfort, realness, a life unfolding. At dinner, Hannah raised her plastic cup like royalty. "To the garden," she proclaimed. "To cornbread," May chimed in. "To staying," Isla whispered shyly. Across the table, Ivy looked at Caleb. Her eyes shimmered, but her smile was steady. "To family," she said. Once the house was quiet and the girls were tucked in, Caleb lit the lantern and pulled out an old wooden box from under the bench near the fireplace. Ivy joined him, curiosity in her eyes. He opened it carefully. Inside were mismatched pieces of a life, a faded photo of a fire crew, a metal badge still pinned to velvet, and the scorched red handkerchief, now tucked neatly into a plastic sleeve. "I've been carrying this box through every chapter," he said. "Not just with me, but in here." He tapped his temple. Ivy reached out and traced the photo with her fingers. "That's you." He nodded. "Back row, right before everything changed." She looked up at him. "Do you regret it?" "Some days," he admitted. "But not the job, not the fire, just the not knowing. Not knowing where it would all lead." He paused. "I thought I'd already missed my chance at something good." She picked up the handkerchief gently, like it might crumble. "But you didn't," she said. "No," he agreed, "because you knocked on the right door." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the box. "Do you ever think about letting it go?" Caleb didn't rush to answer. Instead, he set the badge beside the photo and slowly closed the lid. "I think maybe it's time," he said. "Not to forget, just to keep moving forward." Ivy placed her hand over his. "That's all most of us really need." The weeks that followed unfolded like pages turning slowly. Ivy enrolled in night classes at the local community college. Caleb started volunteering twice a month to help train new firefighters. The cabin stopped feeling like a place people ended up in. It began to feel like a place people stayed. One quiet Sunday, a familiar car rolled up the gravel path. Judge Eleanor Rowan stepped out, scarf trailing in the wind, carrying a paper bag in her arms. "I brought scones," she called cheerfully. Ivy met her halfway down the drive. You didn't have to, she said, smiling. I wanted to see the garden, the judge replied, her smile just as warm. Caleb welcomed her inside, and over soft laughter and warm pastry, the woman who once stood between them in a courtroom now sat with flour dusting her blouse, a child curled on her lap, and nothing left to hide behind. Later, as Ivy walked Eleanor back to her car, she said softly, "You were right, you know." "About what?" the judge asked. "That the law doesn't always define what's right." Eleanor paused, her smile thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said, "we're just lucky enough to recognize right when it knocks on our door." That night, with dishes put away and the girls fast asleep, Caleb and Ivy sat under a sky full of stars. No court dates, no documents, no more waiting, just the hush of night, and two people who had walked through separate fires and found each other on the other side. Just two people, each scarred by a different fire, from different years, who somehow found each other on the other side. Ivy rested her head gently on Caleb's shoulder. "You think it's possible?" she asked. "What's that?" "That broken things can be whole again." Caleb slid his arm around her, holding her close. "It's not just possible," he whispered. "I think it's already happening." The first real spring rain came quietly in the middle of the night. It fell in steady, gentle waves, tapping the tin roof above like a quiet blessing, soaking into the thawed ground as though the earth itself was exhaling. By morning, the air smelled of moss and memory, clean and rich and full of promise. Caleb rose early, like always. He stood by the window in his flannel, watching the raindrops wander down the glass in slow, glistening trails. Behind him, the kettle hummed softly on the stove, a familiar sound that spoke of routine, comfort, and home. Then the floor gave a soft creak. It was Ivy. Barefoot, still tousled from sleep, wrapped in one of his old sweatshirts like it belonged to her now. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said as he poured her a mug. "You didn't," she replied, voice quiet. "The rain did." They stood together at the window, hands warmed by ceramic, eyes on the softened world beyond the glass. "Do you remember the first morning we stood like this?" she asked. He nodded. "You were drenched, clutching May like she might vanish, and you looked like someone who hadn't let himself feel anything in a long time." Caleb chuckled under his breath. "I hadn't," he said honestly. Ivy leaned against him a little more. "And now?" He looked down at her, a softness in his expression that time had earned. "Now," he said, "I can't imagine not caring." Later that morning, the girls set the breakfast table. 5 plates, 5 cups, and in the middle a jar of wildflowers picked 2 days earlier by Ivy and Hannah. The table that had once sat dusty and half forgotten now radiated fullness in every way that counted. As they all sat down, Caleb took a quiet moment to really take it in. What he saw wasn't a second chance or a patched-together life. It was a family. Not perfect, but real. Hard-earned. Beautiful. He raised his mug. To muddy boots, burnt toast, and garden rose that'll probably grow sideways. The girls burst into laughter. Ivy lifted her mug too. "To fresh starts," she said, "and staying put long enough to finish something." Hannah grinned, not wanting to miss her turn. "To not being scared anymore." A stillness settled over them, then gentle, reverent. Caleb's eyes met Ivy's, and their smiles said what words couldn't. That afternoon, Ivy walked into town alone. No heavy coat clutched tight, no head down. She strolled with her coat open and her chin lifted. She picked up her textbooks from the college bookstore, grabbed lunch at a diner, and even sat for a while on the same park bench she used to stop at during the loneliest parts of her journey. But she didn't feel like a shadow anymore. She felt like someone rebuilding by hand, by heart, and by choice. At the hardware store, she bumped into Judge Rowan. The older woman stepped out of her car with an umbrella and a smile. "You look like you belong here," she said. Ivy laughed. "That's because I finally do." Celeste reached into her coat and handed her a small slip of paper. "My daughter's graduating next month. I'd love it if you and the girls came." Ivy accepted it with both hands. "We'd be honored," she said, then added with a grin, "and if you ever want cornbread again, you know where to find us." The judge leaned in, her voice soft. "Your story reminded me why I chose this path. Thank you for living it out loud." Back at the cabin, Caleb and Hannah were working on the fence. Well, Caleb was working. Hannah was handing him tools and offering commentary. "This would go faster," she said, "if we just got a goat." "You only want a goat because Ivy said you could name it," Caleb teased. "Exactly," Hannah beamed. "I'm thinking. Captain Crumbles." Caleb laughed, a full, deep, unguarded laugh. The kind he hadn't let himself feel in years. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Ivy returned and found him waiting. He pulled her aside gently. "I've been thinking," he said. "It's been a long time since I built something that truly mattered from the ground up." She raised a playful eyebrow. "The fence looks fine to me." He smiled, then pulled a small hand-carved wooden box from his back pocket. Simple, unassuming. Inside it sat a ring. "I don't have a big speech," he said. "Just this." He met her eyes. "I love how you move through this house like it's always been yours. I love how the girls reach for you like they were born knowing your hands. I love how this place feels warmer because you're in it." He paused, breath steady. "I don't need a document to call us a family. But if you'll let me, I'd like to give you my name. This time freely. Without hiding. Without fear." Ivy blinked, shocked and smiling all at once. "You sure?" she whispered. "You already have so much." Caleb nodded. "I don't want more," he said. "I want you." Tears filled her eyes, but she held his gaze without wavering. "Then yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. That night, 5 chairs circled the dinner table. One for a girl who had found her voice again. One for a child who no longer asked when they'd leave. One for a sister who now slept through the night. One for a woman who chose to stay. And one for the man who opened his door on a cold night and found his life again. There was no judge. No courtroom. No need for anyone to declare a verdict. Because love, quiet, kind, and undeniable, had already done so. And that was more than enough. Underscore, 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 underscore. Underscore, 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 underscore. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the smallest gesture. A knock on a door. A name whispered in a courtroom. A family forming slowly, softly around a kitchen table. If this story spoke to something in you, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment. You never know who might be reading or who might need a little hope today. And if you want more stories like this, true, healing, quietly powerful, go ahead and subscribe. It truly means the world. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay warm, stay kind, and never ever underestimate the power of opening your heart. White Heart.